Well, I'm so privileged to have Kathy Matsui with me from Goldman Sachs. And Kathy, I understand you just came out with a new book entitled How to Nurture Female Employees. So what can you tell us about your book and how far women's economic empowerment has proceeded in Japan over the past 10, 20 years?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, maybe I'll start with the second part of your question, which is kind of what has been the progress of this topic that I've been researching for over 2 decades called womenomics. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the book fits into this. So when I started writing and researching about this topic over 20 years ago, female labor participation in Japan was one of the lowest in the developed world. It was about 54, 55%. So just around half of the Japanese women who could be working outside the home were actually working, and that was a relatively low ratio. Fast forward, particularly in the last 7 to 8 years, we've seen a very swift and strong spike in that percentage, rising to most recently a ratio of about 71%, which in fact is higher than similar ratios, for example, in the United States, which is around 66, and Europe, which is lower than the States. So I guess the good news is we have seen the numbers go up of women. I think there were over 3 million jobs created for women over particularly this last 7 to 8 year period. And encouragingly, we saw women who traditionally would drop out of the workforce once starting a family, those women coming back to work in larger numbers and more quickly. Usually they didn't return to work, for example, until after their children were old enough to kind of take care of themselves. So number one, the numbers really improved. Number two, we saw finally the government begin to understand that having a population that was facing a severe demographic challenge, they needed to embrace gender diversity in a more meaningful way. And so under Prime Minister Abe, talking about, well, what are going to be the growth drivers for this economy longer term, he latched onto this concept of womenomics and started to pursue things like increasing daycare capacity. There's been almost a 30% increase in daycare capacity over the last, say, 5 to 6 years. Importantly, they've also, for example, made parental leave benefits, which I know in America are still a challenge. But believe it or not, Japan today has probably one of the most generous parental leave benefit programs in the developed world. Both the mother and the father each can take 1 year off. And if you do the math, they can essentially get up to about 80% of pre-leave pay. Now, of course, it would help if more Japanese fathers took that leave. We all know that, but at least the systems and the benefits are pretty generous and provided by the government. And then finally, I would say an area of big progress has been transparency. It was really hard, for example, to open up, the annual report of Toyota Motor in the past and find any information related to gender statistics. And today, thanks to a law that was passed in 2016, any organization with at least 300 employees or more have to disclose some kind of gender statistics. And while it is not standardized, it's not, illegal if you don't disclose the data, a lot of companies have provided, interestingly, enough data so that, for example, young women who are looking to join a company, they can compare side by side different companies. What are the female manager ratios? What does the board composition look like? And so I think from that perspective, there's a little bit more, disclosure and transparency so that people from the outside can judge how, diversity friendly or not is an organization. So those are some of the things I think have helped. What has not really progressed, though, is although the numbers are way up in Japan, we still have a dearth of women, of course, in leadership or decision-making positions. In the parliament, still only about 10% of the lower house, the most important body of the Japan's Congress, so to speak, or parliament, is comprised of women. That is, I believe, still lower than Saudi Arabia and Libya. So we've got quite a ways to go on that one. But also, if you look at the private sector, I think it's something like 13 or 14% of all managers are women. I think it's much more than double, maybe even triple in some other countries in the developed world. Board directorships, I think it's climbed. It used to be 1%, now it's closer to 6 to 7%, but 6 to 7% is also still extremely low. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of taking women. First of all, as we know, a lot of women in Japan also work part-time as opposed to full-time. And so how do we encourage these women to take on more full-time roles? And then with that, stay in those jobs, be motivated enough, be ambitious enough to rise to levels of, real responsibility. And that's where my book comes in, which is after many conversations with a lot of Japanese companies and CEOs, a lot of them have asked me, so I get this, womenomics, I understand that we need to utilize more of our women and female talent, and we have these amazing women who enter the company at a very young age, right out of school, but we're always facing this challenge, how to retain them, how to promote them. The women themselves don't have enough confidence. When we offer them a promotion, they say, oh, no, I can't possibly be qualified. It's too early. It's not me. These sorts of challenges are much more micro in nature. So to me, it's not as if the government has done everything they can to promote more women. There's still, of course, a long way to go from the government side on the policy angle. But I wrote this book because I found that there's a lot of things that need to be done internal to organizations at the very micro, people-to-people level. Managers to female employees, the female employees themselves, what can they do to kind of take more control of their career and their career path? So that's really the genesis of the book.
Yeah. So in other words, government can help, but it's not the answer. It needs to be augmented by private sector initiatives and really cultural differences. And then we have COVID, and that's kind of the focus of our discussion tonight, is what has been the impact of the COVID virus, the lockdown, and then the associated economic downturn on efforts to promote women, both in Japan, but also in Asia more broadly? Because, you've already mentioned a lot of women are in these quote unquote temporary jobs or part-time jobs. Many of them have been the first affected by COVID. Also elsewhere in Asia, I note that there was just an article earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal about how textile workers, which is predominantly female in many countries, have also been, impacted by COVID, and these women have lost their jobs. So can you talk a little about how COVID has affected this kind of women's empowerment movement and outcomes? Is this a real setback?
Well, in some ways, absolutely, because of what you just pointed out, which is not just here in Japan, but I think in many countries. First of all, a lot of the industries that are perhaps most severely impacted by this pandemic have been in the service sectors, right? Whether it be hospitality, leisure, retail, restaurants. A lot of them employ part-time workers, and a lot of women make up that workforce. Let's not forget, I think it's a statistic, at least in the United States, that frontline healthcare workers, 70%, I believe, or close to that, are also women. So obviously they're not necessarily losing their jobs, but they're kind of working with the most risky, positions right now. But I think in terms of the hit to the labor market aspect, it has indeed hit, Japanese women particularly hard. And I think if you think about also, the fact that a lot of the single parent households in Japan are predominantly, mother and child or children, not only have your employment prospects been compromised, but the schools have been shut. So you've been having to deal with, how am I going to earn a living? The government is providing some benefits, but maybe that, cannot cover everything, all of your expenses. And meanwhile, it's hard to even work outside the home when you're having to be forced to stay home and take care of your children or child. So I think these are new and myriad challenges that have really struck a lot of women, not just here, but in Asia. You mentioned textile workers. That's another, very labor-intensive industry that I think has also been dominated by women. So clearly women, I think, have borne, unfortunately, the brunt of the job losses and that damage in many jurisdictions. And at the same time, just maybe talking a little bit about some potential silver linings, though, I have seen here in Japan that, it's not as if we didn't have computers at home. It's not as if we did not have internet. But I think it took this pandemic to really force a lot of Japanese companies and organizations to discover telework, to discover that, wow, I don't have to commute on a crowded train, very long distances each way. I can actually get quite a lot of work done without doing so. And I'm just as productive as I am in the office, and maybe even more productive. So of course, I'm being very, generalistic here. There are certain situations, like I just mentioned, if you're a woman who's, maybe lost her job and has children to take care of course, it's been extraordinarily challenging. But I've also heard many stories of women who've said, now my bosses get it. They understand that I don't need to be in the office, for very long hours every single day. I'm just as productive. I'm actually more productive when I'm working from home. Some of you have even told me I communicate with my colleagues more through work from home because we're forced to have these sort of Zoom calls and these Zoom sessions on a more regular basis. Whereas if you're sitting in the office or next to one another, you may not have a conversation for a very long, patch of time. So I'm not saying that everything is wonderful by any means, but I think there's been this sort of discovery process for many organizations here that are saying, wow, we have a different form of work style. And it was interesting because this comes right on the tails of the government changing the labor laws, right? Which is enforcing a strict legal limit on working hours, right? So the government is already kind of trying to move Japan in that direction. Let's not
Up the number of hours to make sure people got home.
And those are legal limits. So we could be, you could get in trouble if the labor ministry comes and inspects. You have to log all the hours, particularly for your younger staff, right? You have to log all the hours. And if any individual goes over a certain number of hours per month on a consecutive basis, then that is not good, right? But, for many Japanese organizations that base their performance or evaluations on time spent or seniority rather than on output or performance, it's a very difficult, transition for those companies to make. Whereas I think under COVID, it's really sort of turbo boosted this process, like forcing companies to think, okay, it's really hard to evaluate staff on time spent. But let's take another look at, so what do we evaluate them on? What are the metrics we use? We're going to have to look at performance. We're going to have to look at output. We're going to have metrics that are clear and set goals for each individual to enable us to benchmark them and their performance going forward. So it's very interesting how, I think Japan was trying to move in sort of this direction, but it took a pandemic to really kind of force a lot of companies to move more quickly. And I think in that respect, I find that not just for women, I find a lot of men, and especially younger Japanese men, also saying, this is great, I can do this. I don't have to be in the office all day. That's the kind of lifestyle I wanted anyway. And I've always written in my research that I think the Japanese millennial males are really going to help win this battle for diversity and more balance in life, because that is exactly the value set that they're striving for as well.
Mm-hmm. So can I just ask you, on teleworking, how widespread is that in Japan in COVID? Because even the lockdown wasn't a lockdown like in the United States. A lot of people still went into the offices. And my understanding is certain companies were forward-leaning and encouraged teleworking, while others were totally unprepared. And as a result, people had to come into the office.
Yeah. So there are different surveys that have been done. I've seen numbers anywhere from 35, 40% to 60, 70%. Naturally, a lot of that depends on how developed your tech infrastructure is. Do you have that ability to, in fact, work from home? Have you got all the infrastructure and the IT capacity set up to allow you to do that? Of course, with SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, it's probably more challenging, to do that. So I'm not saying that, of course, every organization has shifted 100% in that direction, but if you look now at certain companies having been through this, quasi-lockdown period that we've been in, they've decided, for example, to give up office space because they don't need it. Fujitsu has decided, for instance, to forego half of its office space. 50% for a company like Fujitsu is a pretty big deal, right? And so if you think about, well, what is an office for? It's not as if everybody's going to abandon their offices, of course, but other than, sort of networking internally, maybe brainstorming or just doing things that you need that, contact or presence. A lot of what we do day to day does not have to be, we humans don't actually have to be in a physical, identical space. And in fact, with this technology, of course, we can virtually be almost anywhere. So I think that's really helped a lot of companies think about, how do we use our resources in a more clever fashion?
So this is kind of medium to long term then. It's not just how they're responding right now. You see kind of enduring changes based on this experiment with teleworking.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, for example, a lot of Japanese people were very afraid if they had any kind of ailment during this pandemic, to go to the hospital, right? Japanese love to go to the hospital, as you know. It's socialist medicine, very inexpensive. But they were nervous about doing so. Or they had COVID-like symptoms and they thought, okay, I should go to the doctor, but I don't really want to go to the doctor. And so telemedicine, right? Or this kind of service, which was basically not permissible prior to the pandemic. I mean, it did take them a while and it's still not perfect by any means, but now you can get, your sort of diagnosis online or by phone in a way that was, not even like talked about, not that long ago, even a year ago. So I think it's, again, a silver lining in that when it comes to work, when it comes to healthcare, look at education. A lot of Japanese public schools were still not able or fitted out with infrastructure to be able to carry on their classes online. I have a lot of friends and colleagues whose kids are just hanging out at home for 4 months. They got a sheet of paper with their homework assignments, but that wasn't taken very seriously. And so they discovered, wow, we have a ways to go to be able to transition to an online learning environment. That's still not complete either. So education, healthcare, work, I think a lot of these are now kind of experiencing the benefits and frankly downside of not having this infrastructure competitively is really kind of galvanizing people's thought process about investing in this infrastructure and working in a very different fashion than before.
How about the silver lining about kind of sharing household responsibilities? I've read that as a result of being locked down, Japanese men, some Japanese men have been helping in rearing the children and doing household chores. Do you think this is perhaps a silver lining, something that can be enduring? I mean, you mentioned earlier that particularly the generational change, that maybe a lot of men are seeking more balance in their lives and want to spend more time with their kids. Is that accurate, or is that what we want to hear?
Yeah, so I would say, just anecdotally, that let's just say, very generally speaking, those friends of mine who are, fathers whose children are still at home, right? So relatively younger men have had a wake-up moment discovering that, whilst they were at work, so leave early in the morning, come back quite late at night, there was a lot of stuff that had to get done in the home while they were away. And discovering that, their, share of doing the laundry or taking out the garbage was a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall list of things that had to be done. You saw Motoko Rich's great article on the Japanese gentleman, the Japanese gentleman, being very proud of the fact that he made an Excel spreadsheet of all the tasks that he did for their family. And then he asked his wife to do the same, and the wife's list was much, much longer than his, and he was quite embarrassed. Put it up Twitter account, and just like that sparked a whole conversation in the nation about burden sharing, in the household. But I do think that at the end of the day, for both adults, running a household, having some empathy about what all needs to get done, whether it's just the house, whether it's the children, whether it's the dogs, whatever, and just understanding that there probably is a bit of an imbalance that exists in many homes, that I think that empathy building and that understanding, I believe, is probably a silver lining for many. Now, my older Japanese friends who maybe their children have moved on and they don't really have, I guess, as much of those tasks as younger men would have. I don't see much change on that front, frankly, but generally speaking, I think for the younger families, that's definitely, I think, been one of the.
A few weeks ago, I interviewed someone from the World Bank who's in charge of East Asia, and he was just saying that digitalization was just going to be, it was happening anyway, but with COVID, it's really accelerated. And I think you've already touched upon the telemedicine and the teleeducation and just how, this was a trend already in train, but if it's really accelerated, do you see this in Japan? Because Japan is still very traditional in many respects and some ways behind the curve. Do you see things changing?
I do. And, there's this very almost ongoing joke about, the low productivity in Japan's work style related to the hanko, the rubber stamp that.
Right, you had to go into work just to get the stamp, right?
Somebody's office in a safe, and any important document that needs, quote, a signature and that company stamp, a human being needs to physically go to the office, open the safe, get that stamp the document, and then, be on your way. And so now you're seeing some companies starting to realize, wow, it is quite antiquated, this practice of hanko, and going hanko-less, right? There are many companies, as you know, who still use fax machines, right? So I think a lot of the what I call analog practices are now being scrutinized, and people are thinking, wait a minute, we've done it this way because we've always done it this way, but maybe it is the low efficiency way of doing things, and there is another alternative. So I think that is, again, a positive realization and hopefully a move towards greater efficiency and productivity. I can assure you the young people, I think when they come into these organizations, they say, you're still using a fax machine or you're still using a hanko.
And the people that work for me don't even know what a fax machine is.
Oh, right. And so this sort of, I could almost call it like a reverse mentoring benefit, right? These young people are saying, what the heck, why are we still using this? This is dark age, Stone Age stuff. But that's good. That's really what's propelling us, I think in this right direction. So, we all know, particularly in the non-manufacturing service sectors here in Japan, which have some of the lowest productivity levels in the world, there's huge potential, I think, for upside and improved efficiencies.
More broadly, there have been a number of people who have opined that countries with female leaders have been able to address the COVID challenge much more effectively than countries with male leaders. And they point to New Zealand and Thailand, Germany. Do you think there's any truth in that? And if there is, do you think there's something about leadership among females that lead women to why would they be more effective? Some people have speculated it's because they rely more on experts and scientific information, or they're willing to, really embrace a lot of different information in making decisions. But I would just be, as someone like you who's been studying these issues for so long, do you think there's validity in this assertion? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Well, I never want to say, one gender is better or smarter than the other, but I think the fact that, you've raised examples of countries which have had a better, quote, track record than others in this whole, managing the pandemic, it looks, the numbers are so, the statistics are moving in a direction that look more than just a coincidence, I would say. And so to your question, I think that female leaders, like you said, tend to be more inclusive in their decision-making altogether. So leaning on experts. If they don't know the information, then they depend or ask people who have that information, who have that expertise. I think women have a bit more, shall I say, humility in that regard. They know they don't know it all, and they're not afraid to ask for those opinions from experts outside. And I think that's a common thread amongst, if you look at Angela Merkel, the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern, those people I read almost in every single case, they have relied very heavily on a diverse set of opinions, not just medical experts, but community health officials and other people who are, are day in and day out working, in this sphere. I also think women tend to be perhaps more frank and open in their communication style. That, this is not like what a normal issue that a government policymaker would deal with, like, tax or fiscal policy. This is a health care, related issue, and it is a pandemic. It is a global pandemic. And so I know Angela Merkel received a lot of criticism, I think, in that early stage when she came out and said something like, more than half of Germany's population will be infected. Right. And people were like, why do you say that? Why are you freaking everybody out? But she wanted to raise the level of sort of crisis mentality. She wanted to convey how serious this was to the people. And frankly, I think it worked, right? For people to kind of hear that from your number one, the top leader of the nation. To Jacinda Ardern's, I think she did a press conference in very casual clothing on a Facebook Live session in her living room or something. And just really, she said, I think it was something like, I could have just put out a memo, right, to the nation explaining why we needed to do a lockdown so quickly, when the numbers, frankly, back then weren't that high in New Zealand. But she felt that wouldn't convey the severity of the crisis sufficiently. So she had this very kind of informal conversation, she called the conversation, with the people of New Zealand, and showed her emotion. She wanted to convey to people, this is a very, very hard decision to decide on a lockdown. Look at the economic consequences. Yet, if we do this and if we all cooperate, if we do ABC, we will get the prize. The prize will be, we'll have stamped out COVID or managed it, brought it under control, and then we can go on with our normal way of living. So, and then finally, I would just say, I think maybe it's our just maternal nature that we really are so sensitized to the health of our families, of our communities. And so perhaps maybe, weighing the economic consequence of a lockdown versus the healthcare of health of a society or nation. It's not that, you opt for one or the other, but I think just the balance of those two things, perhaps women put a little bit more emphasis on the health and the sustainability of a population, perhaps over the near-term economic risks.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting to watch and seeing some male leaders that really haven't dealt with this very effectively. No names will be mentioned. So one last question then. So as you look ahead to women's empowerment in Japan, there are compelling demographic reasons why women need to become a more integral part of the Japanese workforce. Are you optimistic? I know, you've already mentioned at the outset in your book that there's still a lot of challenges, but having worked on this for now over 20 years and seeing improvements, are you optimistic as you look forward? And do you think some of these COVID lessons will help to kind of move the dial forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the end of the day, the society of Japan needs to decide, do they want a thriving, growing society and economy or not? And if the answer to that question is they want to have a thriving society, one with a high and continually rising standard of living, then there are only three ingredients to drive growth. That is capital, labor, and productivity, right? And so if the labor factor does not grow, but shrinks, and the other factors are stagnant or flat, you're going to get not a thriving society. And so, yes, you could import more foreigners. Yes, you could find ways to magically raise the birth rate. Good luck with that. But I think the number one most practical solution would be to tap into more of its female talent, or half the population. And I'm optimistic really for a couple reasons. Number one, the comment I made earlier about the younger men. 20, 30 years ago, if you asked, and there were surveys done of young Japanese men who were bachelors at the time, what do you aspire? What kind of partner do you desire? Once you get married, is it a stay-at-home wife, or is it a woman who works like you outside the home? And before, it was overwhelmingly stay-at-home, mother. Today it is exactly the opposite. In other words, more men, Japanese men, desire a partner who is also working outside the home. And so I think what I'm trying to say is the values of Japanese men have definitely shifted from the old generation to this new one, and that has to be positive, because these men are going to be fighting for the same values that women want, right? A more balanced work life, just more flexibility overall, for themselves. And the second factor I think that I raise in terms of my optimism is the world that I work in, which is financial markets. It is almost become, from a quote buzz term, ESG, right, environmental social governance, which was already, very popular, getting very popular globally. But interestingly, with COVID, right, measuring companies on not just how much their carbon footprint is, but how do they treat their employees in a crisis like we've just had, right? Are they keeping their employees on the payroll for the most part? What is the morale like? How are you managing through a crisis? Do you have a diverse board? Do you not have a diverse board? These factors that were kind of already in the mix of ESG, if you look now, for example, at the growth of assets of various investment products, ESG has enjoyed the fastest growth of almost any asset class. And Japan is one of the fastest growing markets, by the way, for sustainable investing. So I think that before COVID, ESG investing was already rising and becoming very popular. But I think with COVID, now people are saying, wait a minute, this is a huge wake-up call. What caused COVID? Maybe it has to do with our environment and the way we humans are treating our environment. So let's look at those companies. Let's look at those companies that are taking our savings, and what are they doing with our money, right? Are they investing for sustainable reasons, or are they destroying the environment? How are they treating their employees? How are they treating their suppliers? What does their supply chain look like? And all these questions sort of come under this umbrella, but my point is that this is not a fad or just a buzzword. This is going mainstream. And this is very exciting to me, because if we look at even the recent AGM season, the shareholders meeting season in Japan, you have a growing number of asset managers who are now saying, if you don't have at least one female board member, we're going to vote against your board or your CEO. and a growing number of asset managers like Goldman Sachs Asset Management, State Street, the proxy advisors like Glass Lewis, they're not moving in this direction. Why? Because they see undiverse boards as a risk factor, right? This is pure economics. This is not a nice to have or CSR thing. This is a pure economic rational decision. So I think that is really also going to force companies to really take a very hard look internally to themselves about the diversity angle, the social angle, the environmental angle. What impact are they having in all of these areas? And that has to be good, I think, for the gender diversity agenda here in Japan. Again, it will take still years to produce more results, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you so much. And I always love to end these interviews on an optimistic note. But we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your views. I wasn't really aware of this ESG term and how important that is becoming, and something we'll have to look at going forward. But also, discussing the work flexibility and the household responsibility issues. Perhaps there are some silver linings coming out of COVID, as we all are still in the midst of trying to manage the COVID situation. But thank you so much. We are grateful for your input, and good luck with your book. It sounds like a great topic, and one where there'll be a lot of interest in understanding more about how far Japan has come already with respect to women's empowerment, but there's still a long way to go. Thank you very much, Kathy Matsui.
Thanks very much, Wendy.
Thank you.